Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. This video is titled The Accelerating Rate of Sea Level Fraud. In order to get people to take action about climate alarmists like to use imagery which invokes primal fear. The fear of drowning is one of humans' most fundamental instincts, so alarmists create pictures like this one showing Manhattan underwater. There's nothing new about this. Alarmists were doing exactly the same thing in 1934, showing Manhattan underwater as a result of the Arctic melting. April 12, 1934. Well, melting icebergs engulf the world. And look, there's the Empire State Building underwater. In 1988, the world's leading climatologist, James Hansen of NASA, predicted that lower Manhattan would be underwater in 30 years, which would have been last year. I haven't heard any reports that Wall Street's underwater, although the stock market is sinking fast since the election last November. Climate scientists are claiming that seas are now rising faster than they have been in 2,800 years. A group of scientists say they have now reconstructed the history of the planet's sea levels arcing back over some 3,000 years, leading them to conclude that the rate of increase experienced in the 20th century was extremely likely to have been faster than during nearly the entire period. This is in direct contradiction to the 1990 UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, which said there is no convincing evidence of an acceleration in global sea level rise during the 20th century. Now I'm going to show you the trickery which they used to create this fraudulent claim. They said seas rose about 14 centimeters from 1900 to 2000 for a rate of 1.4 millimeters per year. The current rate, according to NASA, is 3.4 millimeters per year, suggesting that sea level rise is accelerating. So suddenly in the last couple of decades, sea level rise rates have doubled is what they're claiming. If we go to the NASA webpage, we can see what they're up to. What they did was they switched methodology. Since 1993, they started using satellite data. Prior to that, they were using tide gauge data. They've created this claimed jump in sea level rise rates by comparing apples with oranges. Trying to measure tiny changes in sea level with satellites has a lot of problems. The sea surface is very rough and the orbit of satellites tends to decay over time. These maps were published by the University of Colorado Sea Level Group a few years ago. The top map shows the error in their calculations and the bottom map shows the trend. You can see that pretty often the error is just about as large as the trend. Think about some of the issues they're facing trying to do these measurements. They're trying to measure millimeter changes in sea level with waves that are meters high. And the orbit of the satellite is decaying, meaning that the satellite's moving closer and closer to the Earth every year, which introduces error. It's bad enough that they're doing an apples to oranges comparison, but they're playing other dirty tricks too. They're adding in an extra 0.3 millimeters per year for something called the global isostatic adjustment. This is based on the fact that the seafloor is believed to be sinking since the end of the last ice age, which causes sea level to not rise as much as it would be if the seafloor wasn't sinking. It's true that the seafloor is probably sinking, and if you were trying to calculate ocean depth or ocean volume, using the global isostatic adjustment would be a legitimate thing to do. But for sea level, it's totally illegitimate. Sea level is essentially the elevation of the oceans relative to the center of the Earth. And what's going on at the bottom of the ocean has no impact on the quality of your measurements. The only reason to make an adjustment would be if there was some sort of instrumentation error, and the global isostatic adjustment has nothing to do with that. A sinking seafloor lowers sea level, not raises it as the climate scientists are doing mathematically. And even more fraudulent is that they're only adding the global isostatic adjustment to the satellite data. If they're going to do that, they would need to add it to the tide gauge data too, because it would impact the tide gauge data just as much as the satellite data. But by adding it only to the satellite data, they create this imaginary jump in sea level rise. Now let's look at some of the other trickery which NASA's doing. This is a comparison of their tide gauge data from 2014 and 2019. NASA has altered their data by lowering the 1930 to 1990 data, then creating this hockey stick towards the end to make it look like sea level rise is accelerating, when their old data didn't show any such thing. And it gets even worse if you compare NASA's 2019 data to their 1982 data. In 1982, NASA showed a sharp rise in sea level from 1930 until the mid-1950s, then it went nearly flat for a while. But now they show it continuing its steep rise after the 1950s. they've massively altered their data. If we look at the historical record, we can see that the slowdown after 1950 is probably real. The Arctic was melting very quickly in the early 1950s. February 19, 1952, melting pole ice threat to ports. Dr. William S. Carlson, an Arctic expert, said last night that polar ice caps were melting at an astonishing and unexplained rate and were threatening to swamp seaports by raising sea levels. The glaciers of Norway and Alaska, he said, are only half the size they were 50 years ago. Amazing, the glaciers of Norway and Alaska lost half their mass even before the SUV was invented. And this corresponds to the rapid rate of sea level rise prior to the mid-1950s. But then things changed rather quickly. By January of 1961, scientists agreed the world was colder. In fact, there was a unanimous consensus. An assembly of specialists from several continents seems to have reached unanimous agreement that the Earth is getting colder. And by 1972, a group of 42 top American and European investigators were so worried about global cooling, they sent a letter to President Nixon warning of a new ice age in about a century. So this reduction in sea level rise rates after the 1950s corresponds very closely to what was going on with the climate. The Earth was getting cooler. NASA has not surprisingly erased this reduction in sea level rise rates, just as they've erased the decline in temperature in their temperature graphs. You can see that they did exactly the same thing with their temperature graphs. The black line is the 1974 National Center for Atmospheric Research graph, which shows a sharp cooling after the 1940s, but the current NASA graph has completely erased that. This constant altering of data seems to be standard operating procedure in NASA's climate group. NASA keeps revising their historical data over and over again to make historical global warming worse than it used to look. The claims that sea level rise rates have doubled over the last 20 years to 3.2 millimeters per year are completely bogus. If we go to the NOAA tide gauge webpage, we can see that the absolute global sea level rise is believed to be 1.7 to 1.8 millimeters per year, not the 3.2 millimeters per year which NASA is claiming. There's been no acceleration in sea level rise, as I'm going to now show you. This is the tide gauge graph from NOAA for Lower Manhattan going back to the middle of the 19th century. As you can see, there's been no acceleration in sea level rise rates. It's been exactly the same since Abraham Lincoln was president. If sea level rise was accelerating, there would be an upward curvature at the end of this graph, but you can see that there's actually been almost no change in sea level at Lower Manhattan since 1993, when they started using satellite data. Sea level at Key West, Florida has been rising at the same rate for a century. There's no upward curvature since 1993. In fact, the past few years it's been dropping rather sharply. There's no upwards curvature in Stockholm, Sweden, where sea level has been falling. There's no upwards curvature in the San Francisco Bay. In fact, sea level there is lower now than it was in the early 1980s. There's no upwards curvature at Seattle, Washington. Water seeks a level surface, so tide gauges around the world would all be affected if there was any significant acceleration in sea level rise rates. And 90% of NOAA tide gauges show sea level rise rates lower than the claimed 3 millimeters per year from NASA. If there was a doubling of sea level rise rates after 1993, it would be very visible in the tide gauge graphs, but it's not visible, indicating that it's not real. I created this animation showing the ocean at La Jolla, California in 1871 and at present. You can see that there's been essentially no change. Let's run through that one more time. Look at the ocean levels now and then. Same story at Fort Lauderdale, Florida. This image on the left is from the 1960 movie Where the Boys Are, and this is the current Google Earth image. The beach looks pretty much the same. Same thing in Sydney Harbor. This is an image of Fort Denison in the 19th century, and this is what it looks like now. The high water mark in Sydney Harbor is almost exactly the same as it was in the 19th century. There's no indication of significant sea level rise. In 1988, experts warned that the Maldives were going to be underwater in the next 30 years. Well, this is what it looks like now. Nothing's changed, lots of people out enjoying the beach, none of the islands are underwater. According to the experts, the Maldives were supposed to be underwater last year. It's simply not happening. Over the last 20,000 years, since the end of the last ice age, sea level has risen about 130 meters or 400 feet. All of this is believed to be natural, but the tiny little bit at the end is man-made. That doesn't make a lot of sense. Climate alarmists are trying to scare us into making foolish decisions about energy with their constant fear-mongering. The claims of these authorities are baseless, and people need to learn to stop falling prey to their appeals to authority. Galileo said, "In questions of science, the authority of the thousand is not worth the humble reasoning of a single individual." We need to make intelligent decisions about our energy future based on science and engineering realities. This mindless and baseless fear-mongering from climate scientists has no place in the discussion. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science for a long time.